Talking today with Dr. James Clark of Fenville, Michigan. The interviewer is James Smither of the Grand Valley State University Veterans History Project. Now, Mr. Clark, can you start by giving us some background on yourself? To begin with, where and when were you born?
Born September 3rd, 1920 in Wayne County, roughly near intersection of E-Course and Telegraph Road.
Okay.
On a farmhouse there that was rental.
Okay. Now,
house.
did you grow up there, or did you move around when you were young?
No, I don't even remember too much about that. When I was 4, we moved to an area near Middle Belt and Grand River, triangle formed by 8 Mile Road. There's a little place called Clarenceville, and my mother and father had bought some property and we're building. We lived in the garage house that he built first, and then he started building on a 2-story house and for us to move into. And my mother, I don't remember too much about her. She had tuberculosis and died when I was 6, actually. And the last year, when it was time for my sister and I to go to school, my sister was a year older, she was in school. We went, my dad had to put my mother in a sanitarium and couldn't look after us, so he took us to a stepsister of his that was close by where we were living, and she and her husband had no children. They were teachers in Redford High School in Detroit, or Redford, and took us in and for 3 years raised us. And I went, when I was in the 2nd grade, it was determined that I also had tuberculosis, and so they, I think mainly to keep me away from other contacts, they kept me home, and my aunt homeschooled me so I didn't lose any schooling. And then last few weeks of school, they let me go back to school, and I passed everything so that I was in the 3rd grade. And then my father had understood that place for recovering tuberculosis patients was in Phoenix, Arizona. So he had a Model T Ford that 3 of us went to Arizona in, and we had a sister of his and her husband, who had no children, went with us because he had been in Arizona previously and had a job offer out there. My father had no job offer. He was working at Detroit Creamy as a millwright and mechanic, and thought he could get a job wherever he was. Well, we were in Arizona for a year. When we got out there, we found that all the tuberculosis patients were in backyards out in the sunshine and dying, so that didn't look too favorable, but we managed to eke out an existence there for a year. My father couldn't find work. He was 50, a little bit older, and Phoenix had no industry. It was just a cow town at that time. Actually, Arizona had only been a state for about 15 years, and but schooling was good, and again, the aunt that went with us was an ex-teacher, and so we didn't hurt for education, and my sister, but we did hurt for money because my dad had sold the house he was building, and the payments never came through, and so we had pretty desperate times long about Christmas and New Year's of that year. Why, he answered an ad and took the 2 of us to pick cotton. Mm-hmm. And that's a terrible job. Fingers are bleeding after about 15 minutes if you're not skilled at it, and we certainly weren't. But the farmer was nice, and he gave us some fruit, and my sister and I 50 cents, and my dad $1, and we went back home, and when the mail came through after the holidays, why, my dad had a check, and he bought some chickens and went into chicken raising, and I had some rabbits that I raised, and we made out pretty well and came back to Michigan in September of 29.
And so that's all before the Depression even gets
That was
going.
my ninth, we ride back in Michigan, Ypsilanti, at a park that we rolled out our bedding on, and it was my ninth birthday. And went back to my Aunt Vera's again for another year, and then they had family coming on, and Depression hit, and once again my dad sold property and took what he had, and went with my half-sister and her husband to Hillsdale County on a farm, that 40-acre farm we had near North Adams, Michigan. And we managed, as long as the money lasted, we managed pretty well the first 2 years, but then Depression, farm prices were nothing. We had no cash. We did everything on a barter basis. We'd do things for the neighbors and keep track of the hours, and then they'd give us so much stuff, and then we'd exchange labors in the spring and in the summer for harvest and one thing and another. And we finally could make no more payments on the farm, and we lost that farm in 34, about January 34, I guess, and had a offer for running a truck farm that my cousins, who were in Detroit and had three brothers, had good jobs with Detroit Edison all the time, and they had invested in a corner store in Redford, and furnished the produce and one thing or another for the store from this farm that they had out near Fowlerville. And we went out there, and things were much better for a little while. We were working on what they call shares, or a percentage of whatever profits there were. And we had 20 acres into pickles, and they were all contracted and at a given price, and we had a real good crop. We had 4 acres of melons, and we sold those. That was a pretty good crop. We had cows and corn and one thing and another. And the biggest problem was with the pickles when they came into bearing in last of July, 1st of August. We had a nice bumper crop, and we had pickers and graders, and we're doing everything pretty well. And then the 15th of August, they had a killing frost that knocked out everything. And I was in the 8th grade at that time, and my sister had gone into my aunt's in Detroit, and was going to Redford High School for her first year at high school. In those days in the country, you had to, country schools, you had to pay tuition to go to high school. And the folks, my dad figured that he couldn't afford to send both of us to high school. And since my sister already had 1 year in, and she came back to be with the family, I don't know why, and that she should be the one that would go to, it was only 4 miles away to Fowlerville. And it looked like I wasn't going to go to high school. And then another aunt that who was in Heartland, and she and her husband were school teachers, and he had retired and was managing a big crouse farm in Heartland, 600 and some acres, and my aunt had a big house to take care of and no help, and they had no children, never had any children. So she contacted my dad and said if I wanted to come and be her houseboy, why I could stay there and work my way through high school. So I did that, and well, I got other jobs while I was there. I worked in a music hall and as a stagehand and maintenance, and Walden Woods campsite for. I was a chauffeur for Mr. Krause, an industrialist out of Cleveland for a while, and worked at camp in the kitchen and on the grounds, and 1 year when I was between colleges, I was assistant manager of the place when I was 20, and also we opened a recreation hall in Heartland at that time, and I was the first recreation director and had a roller skating rink, and I was the manager of roller skating. Essentially, I was on my own from the time I was 17.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't going to be able to go to college because I didn't have any, there were no scholarships and I didn't have any money. And I was planning on staying and working in the area, whatever I could find. And the high school superintendent, Mr. McKenzie, called me about 10 days before college had started, and he wanted to know where I was going to go to college. I said, well, I wasn't going to be able to go. And he said, well, you're going to go. He said, I'm going to. So I got to get you in school. He said, if you have at least one term, he said, you'll go back sometime. How much money you got? And I said, well, I got about $300. And he said, well, that's enough. You can go to Eastern Michigan, which was at that time Michigan Normal at Ypsilanti. And he said, that's a good school. You can go any place after that. But he said, why don't you go and get one term? So I went and had one term and starved out, and my money ran out, and went back to work at Walden Woods and doing whatever they had, and then running the recreation program at school, and saved my money, and then went to Michigan State in 40, and was at Michigan State until I was drafted in 42. I had one of the chemistry, was on a pre-med program. I had no hope of being able to go to medical school, but I thought I'd try it anyway. And I had passed my medical aptitude test as a junior, and one of the professors, you know, Michigan State was hurting for students. Everybody was in the service. And this one professor in chemistry said, well, we'll get you into the ROTC officers training program. And I said, my vision they won't take me because of my vision. Yes, he said, we'll fix that. Okay, so I stayed in thinking that they called me in to swear me in to take the oath for being a commissioned officer, and had her hands up and were swearing me in when somebody came in from the medical officer and wanted to know if I was there, and I did, and they said, well, there must be some mistake. Is your vision 2040? And I said, no, it's 2400. So, okay, we can't use you.
Mm-hmm.
I went back to my rooming house and my draft card was waiting for me, and so I was inducted in, which I was happy for anyway.
Okay. Now, I want to back up here a little bit. How did you learn about Pearl Harbor?
It's in the story there. I wrote an article for the Grand Rapids Press saying dates remembered, and the second story in there is Pearl Harbor. I had hitchhiked to my aunt's house in Heartland, and it was Sunday evening, and it was snowing, and I hitchhiked back, and I got to the rooming house, and nobody was around, and we lived up, my roomie and I were on the 3rd floor. So I went up and I was working for my room for my rent, and went upstairs, and I heard the radio on, and the freshman in the one room on the end of the hall had a radio on, and everybody on the floor and the whole house was in there listening to the radio, and they were talking about Pearl Harbor, and that's when I remembered it. And I just had my roommate from the year before had just left and gone into Navy Air Force for training, and he was activated right away quick after that, and spent a year on Guadalcanal, was shot down twice, and then went into training and survived and came back all right. I guess that covers that anyway.
Okay. Now, at the point when that happened, had you already tried to get in
Yeah.
ROTC?
Well,
Or was that coming later?
Michigan State, you had to take the first 2 years in ROTC anyway.
Okay.
And I knew at that time that I wasn't, they told me I wasn't qualified at that time, I wasn't qualified for officers training.
Right.
But anyway, that's,
But you did get your draft notice then, and so then when did you have to report for duty after you were called up?
Well, I was in summer school at the time when that came through, and just happened that within 2 weeks I had my physical, and then I got 2 weeks leave or whatever it was, and I was able to finish my courses in school at that time, which worked out pretty good.
Okay. Now, where did they send you for basic training?
This gets a little difficult because I never really had basic training
Okay.
until I'd been in the service for about a year and a half. They sent me first, I was inducted at Camp Custer, which everybody else was in Michigan. Was there for 3 or 4 days, got my hair cut, got my clothing issued to me, and had to make do jobs to keep me busy for a little while. And I think it was at the end of a week or 10 days, I was sent with a group to, we went to Brooklyn to Fort Hamilton first for some reason. And were there for 3 or 4 days and then put with a different group. And while we were there, I got to see out in the harbor freighters with their rear end blown off because the German submarines were pretty busy at that time, and we all were sure that within 2 weeks we would probably be in Africa or something. Yeah, it didn't happen that way. Anyway, seems that I had on my resume, they fill out a whole aptitude thing on you, and I'd had some laboratory work, and so they were put in a Fort Dix medical or station hospital medical lab, and went right to work. I was there from September until March, I guess. Yeah, March. And then they pulled me out, and another fellow from the lab, an older fellow was from the lab, and we had no idea what they were. They said, well, you've got orders to go to City College in New York, and you're going to go on a special ASTP training program. Didn't have any choice, right? They just said you're going to go. So spent a month there while they tested us and tried to decide what to do with us, and then they finally, I was sent with a group to Syracuse University for engineer training, and I was a corporal at the time, and they said I had all the benefits of going back to school, so I became a buck private again, and the money that goes with it, or went with it anyway. And I was there until November, and at that time it was basic engineering pretty well, and a lot of the students were already graduate engineers. It made no sense. And I'd had some of the courses, some of the math courses, but I did learn surveying and a lot of things about electrical engineering and one thing and another, but I was really interested in chemical engineering, which they didn't offer. Anyway, at November, they scrapped the whole program. And so as a private, I went to basic training, basic combat medical training in Camp Grant, Illinois.
Okay. Now, before we go into that, I'd like you to tell me a little bit more what your life was like. Say, when you were living at Fort Dix, for example, what did you do during a day, and could you get off the base, and what else was there to do?
Oh yeah, it was real handy in Fort Dix. It was pretty loosey-goosey stuff there. At that time, Fort Dix was manned by mostly locals from New Jersey, New York City, and Philadelphia. And in the laboratory, there were only 2 of us that didn't have relatives or wives either working in the hospital or working close by, and they went home every night, which left the 2 of us there on base to take care of things. And the other thing was that the group I was with were nearly all Jewish. And they fought like hell with each other, but they were nice to me and this other kid that was the same age anyway. But both of us had had some laboratory training, and so that's why we were there. And then, as I say, we got to go back to the barracks at regular working day type of thing. We wouldn't hardly know you were in the Army, except you had to fall out for inspection each morning, and we did go through an infiltration course where they had live fire over them. But it was pretty tame compared to what we had to go through at Camp Grant. It was,
Sure.
yeah.
Okay, and then did you get to go into New York City at all? Or,
In New York City, Philadelphia, Trenton, of course, was close by. But you couldn't go to Camden. That was off limits. Too many problems there. And Philadelphia was really a Navy town.
Mhm.
And the Army was not really received that well. But they did, it was a good place to go. I mean, it had nice restaurants. And if we had any money, we could spend it. But New York was wonderful. The USOs in New York just turned themselves inside out. And I got to go to, I had tickets, got to see the opera. I got to go for a live broadcast interviewing one of the boxing. Boxing was a big thing at that
Mhm.
time. One of the boxing champions was on the program. Got to visit with him. Went to some of the plays, and then I went to a program for the swearing in of some immigrants.
Mhm.
And they put on a big program, and first time I ever heard her sing, Frank Sinatra, he was there and sang. There was an opera singer there, I don't remember her name. Number of famous personalities that I don't remember the names of right now.
Okay. Now, was that really kind of a change from life in Michigan and just trying to struggle to survive?
Oh, yeah, I was, by that time, I was used to everything, anything and
Mhm.
everything, so yeah, that was great as far as I was concerned. I had one hang-up that solved itself pretty soon. I'd become engaged to a girl before after I entered the Army. She insisted she wanted an engagement ring, so I bought one and gave it to her for Christmas. And when I arrived at Syracuse, there was a letter there for me saying she found somebody else and given the ring to my aunt, so that all solved itself pretty well.
Okay. Now, what was life in Syracuse like?
We were second fiddle there. There weren't that many of us. I think there were 600, it seems like. And the Air Force had a training program there for a number of months, a year or so, I guess. And so they were pretty well integrated into the town, and we were left on the outside looking in, and were not really well received. We were housed in a fraternity house that was stripped down, SAE, I think it was, and put in bunk beds, and had a mess hall near the center of campus where we had good food, real good food. We did have a physical training exercise that was fairly rigorous, but I had run track and boxed and did a number of things at Michigan State and Eastern Michigan, and so that part was easy for me. In fact, they would ask me, every infiltration course I was at, they asked me to try for the record, and I think that was just a gimmick to make everybody else think that there was a goal there or something.
Mhm.
But anyway, they didn't tell me whether they set the record or not. But Syracuse had both a cross-country program that was real tough and a boxing program, and I was right at home with those.
Mhm. Okay.
Food was great. We had steak probably about once a week, which was sure beat food at Fort Dix. Was terrible. And we had fish with scales on and chicken with feathers. I tell you, it was poorly prepared and just not good at all. I never could learn to eat Philadelphia scrabble and some of that stuff. Anyway, when they decided to scrap the program, why, I was given a week, I think it was at Thanksgiving time, and then was told to report to Camp Grant, Illinois, and
Mhm.
started them with basic combat medical training, which was real rugged.
Okay. Can you describe a little bit what your training program was like?
Well, you get up about 5:30 or 6 in the morning, and for half an hour we had to get inspection, be shaved, and one thing and another, pull off. And then you went through a calisthenics thing that were real strenuous for about half an hour. And then we went to various courses in how to do splinting and first aid, and then medical courses in nursing care and fracture handling, unconsciousness. And one of the final drills was we had to go through an infiltration course there at night, which is quite spectacular. And they had live machine gun fire overhead about 3 feet off the ground. And we had to take turns carrying each other on a litter, 4 men two men and a patient on a litter. And then we had to take turns being on the litter. Well, I was lucky. We didn't have anybody that weighed more than 150 pounds. It would have been a problem. And then when you got to the end of the course, why, there was a barrier that you had to hoist them over. Fortunately, the machine gun fire wasn't on at that time, but you had to be practiced so that you could take a litter over an obstacle. And we had live gas training also. They put you in an old shack that with your gas mask and equipment on, and well, incidentally, that's one of the reasons that I was able to go to combat, because when I was drafted, they told me that because of my vision and the fact they couldn't fit gas masks around eyeglasses, that I wouldn't go into any combat situation. Well, they invented some inserts in the gas mask so that that was no longer a problem, which I was happy about that. Anyway, I got where I wanted to go. Anyway, you got into this chamber, and by this time you had samples of what different kinds of gases smelled like, and had put a test of skin chemical. I can't remember which.
Was it mustard gas or something like that?
It was the one that came after mustard. Yeah, mustard gas was the early one. I can't remember what the name of the new one was. But anyway, I guess they did both. And anyway, which left a scar on my arm for about 20 years. And then when you're in there, they yelled gas. Somebody, without warning, yelled gas, and you were timed as to when you could get to. And it was actual live phosgene gas. If you didn't get your gas mask on, you were going to be sick. And that was part of the training. I can't, because I'd had that training. Then when I got assigned to the 106, they named me as the gas officer, the chemical warfare officer for the unit, which everybody threw their gas masks away as soon as they got over there and used them for something else.
Okay.
Where was I?
We were talking about the training at Camp Grant. So you got, so you had the medics training. Did they also give you the regular infantry basic as well?
No. Okay. Not there.
So you didn't get the same exercise, discipline, all of that kind of thing?
We didn't have to march much. It was pretty much cerebral stuff to get you in on-hands training, simulated stuff and one thing or another that you had to do. We had pharmacology, we had regular medical, not in depth, but in sequence anyway.
Now, what kind of people were in the class along with you? Did they have some college experience like you did, or were they all sorts?
When I was at Camp Grant, that particular unit, they rotated groups in and out of there to finish their training about every 5 weeks, I guess 4 weeks actually. We were there for an extra week. I was there for an extra week. It depended on where they were going to send you. If you didn't have any orders come through, you stayed there until somebody wanted you. And I was there for 5 weeks. But most of those were ASTP. A lot of them were ASTP. That's why they scrapped the program, and they needed us for other things. And most of us were bright enough to be adaptable to pretty nearly anything. In fact, I think most of us qualified as officers if it hadn't been for circumstances.
Right. Okay, so after those 5 weeks, what happens next?
Well, then I was sent down to, one of the things, at Camp Grant, of course, was all medical things. The general in charge was the Surgeon General, and everything was medical. And the payoff was, though, that they had housed some German prisoners from the SS in Africa. And they were housed in one end of the compound of very limited security. But because of that, of them being there, why, it was determined that we had to walk guard duty. Well, guard duty, they gave you a billy club and you walked around and did your guard duty that way. And the only guard duty I ever had in the Army was there and with the billy club, and it was on Christmas Eve. And the snow was about 2 feet deep, and the wind was blowing like crazy, a blizzard of all sorts. And of course, nobody was stirring except me on guard duty, and whoever else was waiting to relieve me. And so that was 24 hours of off and on real misery. And we didn't have good winter equipment. We had an overcoat and a wool cap with regular hose in place of regular overseas cap, and a scarf. I think they did have an Army issue scarf, and overshoes. And that was our winter gear. And they were real strict on just about everything Army, except, you know, we didn't have the arms training. It was, now later, when the Marines in particular, and I didn't talk to too many of the Army medics in the Pacific, but they were trained in all the operating of all the arms, you know. And when we were training after the war, and Europe was over, and I was with the reconstituted units, and we were training to go to Japan, then I shot every weapon up to the 105 howitzer.
But at this point, you didn't have that there yet. No. Did they enforce the discipline carefully? I mean, follow orders and...
Discipline, but mostly it was on how clean your barracks were. Man, that place, they'd open up the air ducts and everything else and check to see if there's any dust or anything around. If there was, anyway, the whole barracks got confined to quarters, and you kept cleaning all weekends, and otherwise we got to go in. Chicago was nice for, I was only there for 2 weekends, I think, but that was nice for U.S. Old Town and one thing. People there would send in names to, if anybody wanted to come for dinner at the place, and I went for family dinners a number of different places on 2 or 3 different occasions. And people that were there wrote me letters after we were in service, after we were overseas.
Okay, so then do you leave Camp Grant early to 1944 then?
I was arrived in Fort Jackson, South Carolina, to join the 106th on New Year's Day of 1944.
Now, how do they move you around the country when you're being assigned to these units?
Well, when I went from Battle Creek to Fort Dix, with a stopover at Hamilton, Fort Hamilton, was by train. Trucks would meet you at the depot and take you to the camp usually. I think at Custer, the train went right into camp and you just got off the train there. But at Fort Jackson, I was picked up by a truck at the station there and taken to, well, my orders read that I was to be with, I think it was K Company of the 424th Infantry. But that was only just because they had an empty barracks where they could put us temporarily, and then I think within a day or so I cut out orders to Division Artillery Medical.
All right. Now, when you're assigned to the medical unit of an artillery unit, do you get different training or practice than you get, or were you just now going on the job?
Pretty much continuation of the same thing. All of those medics had not been at, had gone through combat medical training. They'd gone through basic training there, and then whatever medical training the medical officers there gave them, which was pretty much the same thing, except they didn't have quite as strenuous procedures as we did.
Mm.
It wasn't continuous. I mean, they had other things that they were involved in other than that, and they had on the range practice. I mean, they went out with the howitzers and mixed up with the artillery personnel, which was much better anyway. But I was only there for about 3 weeks, and then they moved us to Tennessee maneuvers in near Nashville, Tennessee, from last of January until March, I think it was.
Okay. And what were you doing in those maneuvers? What was your part of that?
Well, it was training for the Battle of the Bulge.
Mm-hmm.
And with the artillery thing, what they would do is they would have what they call them exercises, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
And they would, different battalions and different, in fact, there were 2 other divisions at different times. I think there was only 2 divisions at a time, but one of them was changed and another group came in. I think we were there for the 75th, and then just before we left, I think the 17th Airborne came in for maneuvers. But anyway, what you did was simulate what was going to happen. And the one thing that was consistent, what we found when we got in Belgium and Germany, was the weather. It was miserable weather in Tennessee. The snow was come and go, and mud everywhere, and when the snow melted, the streams would flood, and people had problems that way, because we used the streams were all limestone road beds, and they were better shaped than the roads. So part of the time we drive down the stream to get, then you had to be sure that you got a bank you could climb up with a Jeep before you could get out of it. And that was the main thing, was fighting the weather and continuing with, one of the referees or whoever was in charge, judges or whatever, would suddenly appear in the area and drop a flare, and that meant that you were under attack. And then somebody would come along and put a tag on somebody as being wounded or something, and we'd have to do what they had to do. That was essentially what the training was.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty boring most of the time, actually.
Now, were you camping outside the whole
Oh,
time?
yeah. Oh, yeah. You couldn't, all that limestone, you couldn't drive a tent stake. You had to weight them down with rocks or something. And it was good training. It was miserable.
Mm-hmm. All right. Now, did you get to go back to South Carolina after that, or did you go somewhere else?
No, we went to Camp Atterbury, Indiana. More training. They took all the good NCOs and one thing out there to send them over to England to get ready for the invasion. We weren't ready to go as a unit yet, but they took our trained personnel and old timers and sent them over there. So we got fresh inductees in again. Some more AST people came in at that time, and I think we were the last unit activated. 106 was, and at one time they said we had the youngest group in services at that time, and actually because of the influx of the college dischargees, we had some of the better intelligence groups, and were able to function by ourselves pretty well. Probably saved us
Mm-hmm.
considerable time. Yeah.
All right. And then, do you stay at Camp Atterbury until they ship you overseas, or do
Yeah, we were there until October 44, and then we got a whole bunch of new people because of them having drained us periodically and retraining and one thing and another. We had a group of new people, and for instance, all the time I was with the 106th Division Artillery Medical Unit, was supposed to have a Divardi medical officer, which was in charge. He was a major. Major Dreyer was the one that was there. And he was supposed to have a surgeon with each battalion. And he was the only surgeon we had until we got ready, till we got to Atterbury, and within a week, about 2 or 3 weeks, I guess, before we were ready to go overseas, we had medical officers assigned to us, you know, to be with us. But they were strangers to us when we got. I had been Major Driver's driver for all the time I was in the 106 until we got ready to go overseas, and I met the officer that was going to be over me about a week before, and had never driven, and never actually drove him because in Atterbury we were right there. They just stayed in the dispensary and weren't traveling out, hadn't any combat experience or anything either way. But we got those officers just before we went overseas, and everybody got filled up to strength, whatever the decision was. We had fellows that were with us, had been with us, that never went over with us, and we had replacements at the last minute, even when we got to the POE at Camp Miles Standish in Massachusetts. The last minute we had some older fellows that were just deemed not fit for combat, and so we had some new younger people come in. And that was where we were given a choice. So one friend of mine that was also from ASTP, but he had been with the unit about a month before I arrived. He'd been with the Divardi Medical Attachment, and he had about as much pre-medical training as I had. And the major called us in and said one of us was going to have to go to the 590th as a chief NCO with a medical officer there. We had just had these new fellows in, and one of them was a Japanese doctor, Dr. Yamazaki, and he was a real nice guy, and both of George Bullard and I had worked together with him, just on sick call, and he was real funny and real entertaining, and we both liked him. And so Major Tarr said, "Well, one of you's got to go, and you have to choose between the two of you." So we talked it over, and George had been, since he'd been there longer, and it was going to be a jump in rank considerable. I was corporal at that time, and George was a private actually. And I said to George, I said, "Well, I'm not used to that particular group. We knew all of the Divardi medics, but I hadn't spent any time in the field with them. I had been with Major Dreyer." And I said, "I do know the 592nd because Divardi at that time, the medics were housed with 592nd. And I said, you've been here longer than I have anyway. Why don't you go ahead and take it?" So they said, "Yeah, I did." Of course, he's the one who was captured. And I didn't. But the payoff was that when they reconstituted the unit, I got his job. Not only that, I got Yamazaki's job because I operated with the unit out in France until the end of the war without any medical officer. There wasn't any medical officer within 200 miles of us.
All right. Okay, so they move you out, you go to Camp Miles Standish, so go to Massachusetts. What kind of ship did they put you on to send you overseas?
We had an ex-luxury liner, and that was, at that time, was designated as the SS Wakefield, and can't remember at this point what the luxury liner's name was. But anyway, it had been in a couple of fires, and I'd been re-outfitted with, there wasn't any swimming pool, and we had, I was down the fourth deck down, I think, right next to the water, and you were the aisle between the bunks. The bunks are three and four stacks high, and just a canvas on a metal frame. And the aisle was only about 2 feet wide and 5.5 feet long in front of each one of them, and you had to have your duffel bag and everything that you had, all your possessions had to be right in the bunk with you. And then they'd blow the whistle every morning, and you had to jump out and get dressed and and have inspection, and there was no place to jump and no place to get trapped. It was ridiculous anyway. Then we always had the encouraging thought that, well, we're down here in the bottom, we're gonna be the last ones out and the first ones to get wet.
Mhm.
Man, everybody was sick. They had a real bad storm when we got out of the Boston Harbor the night we got out, and well, the waves were 20 feet high, and the wind was howling, and everybody, including most of the crew, was sick. I wasn't sick, but the food was real unappetizing, and I shouldn't put this on there probably, but I was. You went into the mess hall, you had to line up twice a day and get in line. If you wanted anything to eat, you didn't have to line up if you didn't want to eat. But you went in and stood at the mess hall with long metal trays, tables that had raised edges on them so that the trays wouldn't slide off. You had served on a tray, and there were maybe 10 or 12 people on the length of the whole length of the table. And of course, with the ship lurching and one thing around, you'd start to eat your tray, and it would, if there was nobody next to you, it would slide down, and you'd get the guy from way up on the other end sometime, depending, and of course, there wasn't anybody eating much. And this one time, I went to eat, and my tray slid away, and then this other fellow's tray, and he vomited in the tray. I decided I didn't really want to eat that. The food was usually beans anyway, and it was terrible on board the ship.
Now, did things quiet down a little after a day or so?
We were out, I think it was I think we were on board ship 7 days, I think. And after about the 4th day, when we got out into the Gulf Stream, it was nice. And then we pulled into Liverpool for debarking and went to Cheltenham area for getting all new equipment, and then boarded LST to go across the channel.
Okay. And so when did you actually cross the channel?
Got a little story there on it. It's December 2nd, and we were supposed to land there the next day. We boarded it the afternoon on the LST, and we were in Weymouth, which is south coast of England, and the channel was supposed to be crossed, and we were supposed to debark the next day in Le Havre. We're scheduled to. And when we got out there, it was, the first night was real good because the Army-Navy game was on. And the sailors had the radio on, and we could hear it. And Army won, which was nice too. But they only had provisions for us for 2 meals. And a meal, and it was just past Thanksgiving, and they still had stuff from Thanksgiving, so we had turkey and dressing, and of all things, we had ice cream too. It was the only time in the Army I think ever got ice cream. But the storm came up and loosened the sea mines at the entrance to the harbor, and so we tossed around out there for 4.5 days. And of course, the ship was loaded we went right from there to the combat zone, so we were combat loaded. And my vehicle was on the upper deck, my Jeep and the medical detachment's 3/4 ton with our equipment in it. And the Navy had it rigged so that their passengers would have 3 shifts for sleeping. And you had an assignment of the area that you were going to sleep in. Mine was in the anchor chain locker compartment that was just right next to just an empty compartment where I crawled up in and stretched out for 8 hours, and then traded with somebody else. But in the meantime, we could sleep in our vehicles out on the deck, which wasn't very comfortable with all the storm either, so we had to entertain ourselves some way and just wandered around the ship usually, and it was quite an adventure. I had one of the fellows was, for some reason, they didn't have as many seasick there as on the liner, but part of it was because they were so heavily loaded, that thing didn't move around much. It was like a rock, and but they went down in the hull where the guns and the prime movers were, and down in the lower, and that was all awash with about 3 feet of water, and those big door openings on the bow, they don't close. There's a gap in there, and the water would come pouring in, and the pumps would pump it out. And, so that was quite a thrill. And,
Did they ever bring you more food, or did you just have to get by?
We had to go by on the rations that we had to carry us to the front.
Mm-hmm.
So first thing they had to do was to find some way of restocking us, and that wasn't very thorough. We didn't eat very well until we got to St. Vitt, and that was supported with. We were never able to quite figure out how the march order went, because they had taken our trucks that we trained with for pulling the howitzers and had substituted half tracks. Our mechanics, they had no experience with half tracks, and the road situations were not really geared for high-speed travel, so it took us longer than, the rest of the division was. Back in France, we had to, when we finally got quieted down, we couldn't land in La Havre. We went up to the River Seine to row in and beach the LSTs there, and then we had a problem because the elevator jammed. We were on the top deck, and when they got the other decks clear, the elevator jammed, and we couldn't get off the top deck. And I thought, oh boy, we'll be here for a day or so before they can get that thing fixed. Within minutes, they had another LST right up beside us and took down the guide rails and put a plank across, and we drove across and used their elevator. Those people, those Navy people, they had an answer for everything. Real good, except for feeding us when they didn't have any food.
Okay. And then from there, do you just start driving until you get to the front, or?
We did, they didn't. They apparently, from what I learned otherwise, with this woman whose father was with me at the time, was with the 590th at the time, they took a different route, I think, from all I can tell. I don't remember too much about the drive. First of all, we drove almost continuously with those, at a slow speed with those half tracks. And especially when you're driving in blackout, you just look for those cat's eyes ahead of you, and you just hypnotize. You don't know or think or do anything. You can't remember anything except keep that interval and hope that you get a place to pull over and take some rest sometime.
Right.
But we drove for, I'd say at least 20 hours a day at low speed.
Now, were you driving a Jeep at that
Yeah.
point? Yeah, okay.
But I was driving for a new medical officer that I'd never driven for before. Didn't know him, he didn't talk to me, I didn't talk to him. It was not a good journey.
All right. And then where did you stop? Was that St. Vith, or was it?
St. Vitt.
Yeah.
We pulled over the side of the road for about midnight for 2 or 3 hours rest usually, and somewhere along the line we'd get some sea rations or something that somebody would heat up in a barrel and toss it to us, and we'd open it, eat it, and get on the road again. But the officer was less used to that than I was. I'm sure he suffered more than I did.
Okay. Now, so when did you actually then get up to that area?
St. Vitt,
Yeah.
we arrived at December 10th,
Mm-hmm.
the middle of the night, and we were driven all this way in blackout, and we got to St. Vitt, and the 2nd Division was there, and they were all yelling at us for stupid asses for driving with your lights out. They'd been there for a month without any problems at all, and they had no qualms about keeping blackout or anything else. So that was quite a revelation, and it was a snowstorm. Snow was about oh, I would say a good 8 inches deep and real wet. And the ground was not completely frozen underneath, so it was partly mud and one thing or another. We pulled into a bivouac area and I just fell out of the Jeep and fell asleep in the snowbank with my sleeping bag until somebody woke me up in the morning. And then it snowed off and on periodically for another week or two.
Okay. Now, when the Battle of the Bulge actually starts, about less than a week later, most of the 106th Division was kind of farther forward, farther east of Saint-Vith, kind of up. They were working their way towards some dams or something like that. So you weren't.
No, the dams are further north.
Yeah.
They were east, but mostly north, but the 2nd Division went up to jump off against the Ruhr Dam.
Right.
And we took over supposedly in their positions, which was what we did,
Right.
which was not a good idea as it turned out, but, yeah, they, St. Vith is, well, to where we were at Laudisfeld on the Skyline Drive, it wasn't that far to Schoenberg, which is where the road divides. You can go one way, almost due east, a little bit south to Bleilhof, the town, the next fair-sized town, which is in Germany.
Mm-hmm.
Or you could go the other way to Aue, which is in Germany also. St. Vith is in Belgium.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was kind of a triangle, and where we were and where most of the other artillery units were on Skyline Drive, and you could go, to get there, you had to go either to Bleilhof or to Aue.
Mm-hmm.
But when we went in, when the 592nd went in to relieve the 2nd, their artillery battalion, which I don't know the number of it, but you had to, for some reason, they had decided to take a farm road that went from Andler on the Aue, Schoenberg Road, was just a farm lane that apparently some of the farmers were related on both sides of the line, and that was traversable, but we just got in, we got stuck, had to put on chains, and the shaft tracks didn't do as well as they were expected to, and we were hung up in the field there for, it wasn't very far, it went over 2 or 3 miles, but traveling there, and then they closed it down and wouldn't let us use that anymore, which was kind of bad during the battle because they couldn't go out the back way, they had to go the other way.
All right.
Where do we go from there now?
Well, basically, you made it to Saint-Vith, and you moved up toward the positions. You're taking over the 2nd Division's positions now.
Yeah.
Did you get eventually to the place where the artillery was supposed to set up?
Oh, yeah.
So you were deployed by the time the battle actually starts.
Oh, yeah, we were deployed, actually, we were pretty well in our place, we were pretty well into position by the next day. And it was nice and quiet, except for the weather, and we did have a couple of times when it cleared a little bit and the sun came out. And we were in a farmhouse, had the medical detachment aid station in a farmhouse. It was a nice little farmhouse. There in Belgium, the barns and the houses are all one unit. And it had a nice cozy little barn on the backside and a kitchen with kitchen stove and one thing and another. But they had an outhouse, they had no running water. They had an outhouse. And the outhouse had lost its roof. And since we were gonna be there for some time, I decided I would repair the roof. So I got some thatching and managed to get the roof all repaired so people could have a cozy place. And when the artillery barrage started on the 16th, there went my whole outhouse. I didn't have, one of the shells landed in my outhouse, anyway.
At the point, at the point when you went up to that position, were you assuming that you'd finally get to settle down for a while and not have too much
Oh,
to
yeah,
do?
they told us this was just a holding situation, that the war is gonna be over by Christmas anyway, and not to worry about anything. But on the way up there, when we got stalled in the line to get into the positions on that farm road, why, there was an airburst about a couple hundred yards away, and I don't know about anybody else, but I thought, uh-oh, this is the real thing. And I was grateful when they said, put your chains on, because then I was underneath the Jeep in case any more airbursts came along. They didn't get any more airbursts until the morning of the 16th, and then we got everything, yeah.
All right. Now this tape is just about done, and this looks like a good moment to stop and switch.
Is the lighting all right here now? Because it's.
Yeah, actually, that's it's improving.
Should-
There will be a little bit of glare off of your glasses in
Should
here.
be a little better, because I don't feel the glare like I did anyway.
Yeah. Okay, now we were sort of at the point in your story where the Battle of the Bulge actually begins, so about December 16th, 44. All right. Basically, how did that start, at least from your experience? Or was it the morning, or?
Started about 5 o'clock in the morning with a tremendous artillery barrage over the whole area. In fact, we had on this farmhouse that we were staying in, we were on the upper floor, the medical personnel, and we had blackout shutters on the windows, and we still didn't use much in the way of light anyway, but we had somebody put blackout shutters up, we didn't have them. And it blew the shutters right off their hinges, and close enough for that. But we didn't have any casualties at that point in our particular unit. And things kind of quieted down, and it was another one of the fortunate circumstances for me anyway. Was the night before, Captain Hanlon, the medical officer that I was driving for, said they were having problems with trench foot up. We had forward observers up in the Siegfried line pillboxes, and they weren't very comfortable up there, I guess, and they weren't able to take care of their feet like they should, and they had some personnel that were having complaints. They thought they had trench foot, and he wanted me to go up with a forward observer party and into the pillboxes and check these fellas' feet. And so I was set, from the night before, I was all set to go up with a forward observer. Well, as it turned out, at the last minute, before I went to bed that night, they got word that Captain Richmond, battery commander for the 592nd, headquarters battery, was going to go up and take some exchange personnel, and they were going to bring these two fellows, I think, with trench foot back. Instead of me having to go up, while they were going to bring them down to me, which was fine with me. I didn't care one way or the other. I thought it was going to be pretty exciting up there. Turned out, Richmond never got there. He got temporarily captured, escaped, and his driver got captured, and he made it back to the unit later that afternoon. But I was then told by the captain that we needed to go get some medical supplies at 331st back in St. Vitt, and that I was to pick up 2 trench foot casualties that were ready to come back. And because it seemed to me a little shorter, I went, because I could go one of 2 ways, to fly off or to on the drive, on Skyline Drive. I decided to go towards Awe because Richmond, Captain Richmond and his group were in a vehicle just ahead of me. And I'd been that way several times before. Almost every day I had to go back into St. Vitt. And when we got into outskirts of Awe, there's huge craters in the middle of the road, and the engineers are out trying to get repaired for them. Man, this is really something. This is no just hit and miss type of thing. This is going to build up into something, but everybody else is out there just trying to scare you. They know we're new on the line, and they're trying to scare us, you know. Well, as it turned out, I had to go straight on through All before I could take the turn to go to Andler, and Richmond had to turn to the right to go to the pillboxes. And I learned out later that within 2 minutes of the time he got out of sight, they were surrounded by Germans. The Germans were that close already in town, which I didn't know at that time. So I made it through without any problem. It was fairly nice. It had a little sunshine off and on, but then the fog came on because the snow was beginning to melt and the moisture came out of the snow. I got back to St. Vith and there was two of the medics from 590th were there, and they had come in through Blyoff and had gotten in just before me. And they said, "How did you get here?" And I said, "Well, I came through all." And he said, "Well, we came through Blyoff, which was only a couple of miles from their medical detachment." And he said, "We ran into a German patrol." And he said, "They tried to stop us." And Jank was a young Polish fellow, I think, real character and real big muscular guy. He said, "Yeah," he said, this guy jumped out and aimed his rifle at us. He said, "I grabbed the rifle and hit the accelerator and we came on through." He had the rifle, had the rifle to show. But he said, "I don't think we want to go back that way." And I said, "Well, I don't think you do either." But the guy said, "I had no problems going through all." So, well, they bombed the place and tore it all up and shot it up. But I said, the engineers are out and working on it, and it was quiet when I went through there. So they said, "Well, we're going back." And I had to turn around and go back as quick as we can because we got a lot of casualties. They brought in a load of casualties. We got a lot of casualties. And so their names are Jank and Nixon. And when I started back, I told them, I said, "Well, why don't you go back through all then?" And I had no problem. Anyway, they said, "Yeah, they're going to do that." Well, I had to pick up some stuff, and I picked up my 2 casualties to return and was on the road and going towards the law. And when we got to Schoenfield and turned on the road to go to Law, there was a recon vehicle pulled back and the road kind of camouflaged off it. And then sort of 14th Cavalry Group, I think it was, had on the bumpers plate, and an officer came out and stopped me. He said, "Are you going up through all?" And I said, "Yeah." I said, "Let us know what you find." He said, "We understand there's some Germans there." He said, he said, "We'll be here if you have to turn around and come back. We want to know about it." I said, "Okay." It didn't sound too inviting, but anyway, got up there and just on the outskirts of all, there was a rifleman in the ditch aiming up the road, and we stopped and asked him what was going on. He said, "Well," he said, "I'm with the engineers group and we got routed out of there this morning early." He said, "The Germans have been in the town ever since about 8 o'clock this morning." And he said, "They've got some well, actually they were self-propelled artillery, really, lightweight tanks, whatever you want to call it." And he said, "Every once in a while I see one poking his nose out, but they haven't tried to come down this way." I said, "Well, that's not going to go that way then." So then I went around the other way, and that was blocked off south of Blyoff with an ammo train for 590th and 592nd. Boy, I think there were 2 ammo trains there. And they were pulled over the side of the road, and I stopped and asked him. I said, "Well, what's going on?" He said, "Well, the Germans up at Purple Heart Crossroads and in Blyoff." And he said, "We're waiting for the infantry and engineers to clear them out if they can so we can deliver the ammo." And I said, "Well, do you think I can get through?" I said, "It's up to you." And about that time, somebody came down the line and said, "Hey, they say it's all clear, we can go through." Well, I didn't want to be in a convoy of ammo going through Purple Heart Crossroads where the Germans periodically throw a shell in there, and had observation of it all the time anyway. So I said, "Well, I'll see you guys there, then I'm going to go on ahead." So we went on up and went through and actually didn't have a problem there, but around the corner was the aid station and headquarters for both 590th and 422nd Infantry had some headquarters there and buildings there. And I stopped in because I wanted to see if Jank and
Nixon.
Nixon had gotten them back. And the first thing I got, they were knee deep in casualties of all kinds, Yamazaki and Bullard, and I said, man, you guys got hit bad. He said, yeah. He said, we lost our commander. He said, the first thing, and that was Pratt, or was Pitt. Said Jack Pitt, service battery, I think it was, commander, was killed right away quick. And there's another story with that, because I met his twin sister 64 years later. They said, you got any equipment, you got any supplies? And I said, well, we haven't been hit bad. I said, yeah, I've got supplies for us, but I guess maybe I better leave with you, because I said, when I left this morning, we didn't have any casualties. I can, always go back and get some more. So I left out most of my supplies with them. Went up the road a ways, and there was a anti-aircraft installation of their gun battery. Just one gun, but those things are pretty wicked and do a pretty good job. Well, they apparently had been shooting at a self-propelled gun or lightweight armor of some kind, and they knocked him out just beyond the headquarters for 589th, and one of the officers from the 589th was directing fire. And when I drove up there, why, the tank or whatever it was had gone back out of sight, and he wanted to go to headquarters to where their gun batteries were. They were in with us at the 92nd. And so he hopped on the Jeep, and I took him up to drop him off at headquarters, and then and I spun around and went back down the road to Laudesfeld, where we were, to get out of that one. And when I got down there, why, they still hadn't had any casualties, but I had just gotten out of the Jeep and discharged my two riders, and we had a shell hit the cook shack for, it was about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, hit the cook shack for a service battery, and I grabbed, another fellow and I grabbed stretchers and ran, because we knew that somebody was fixing the evening meal. And there wasn't much left of either one of them when we got there. The shell had come in through the roof and landed in a steel 10-gallon cooking vessel for chocolate pudding. There's chocolate pudding and body parts all over everywhere. And we just loaded them on the stretcher and took them back.
Mm-hmm.
But then that's when everything else started. We got word that the gun battery's about a mile away on the hill between us and all, in the countryside. We're under fire, and that Lieutenant Alexander had been killed, and they had a bunch of casualties in a machine gun outpost up there, and so Sergeant Stone and I got in the weapons carrier that we used as an ambulance, and drove up on the hill to see what we could do, because the only aid man we had up there, Bob Morrow, was out of supplies and was pinned down with the rest of them, and so we went into this dugout that had a log shelter over the top of it, had a window that faced all actually, and an open doorway in the back, no door on it, and it was about 4 or 5 feet deep. The 2nd Division had put it up, and all kinds of comfort that they could get there while they were there, and was covered with wood. I don't remember, it was log. I guess it was logs there, planks of some kind, and the machine gun pit was outside, and there were about 5 or 6 wounded. I can't remember exactly. I think 6 wounded in there, and some more out. They had used up their ammunition. They had 1 bazooka left, and they were trying to get to Lieutenant Alexander and pull him back. He was dead already, but they wanted to get him back, and there was another one or two that were wounded out there, and, but not badly wounded, and, we were working on these wounded in the gun pit there, and the, German, artillery came around the corner from a church up on the hill, I don't know, several hundred yards away. The problem was that our howitzers are right there, but you couldn't depress them to shoot them. And so we were having to use, and we hadn't had any supplies from what we got in England, and we short on bazookas. I think the fellas out there had the last bazooka, and they're trying to get close enough to knock him out. And then the machine gunner opened up, and I said, "Hey, you'll draw fire for us, we're working in here." He said, sorry, I said, "I gotta shoot you, I gotta cover the fellas trying to get that tank." And so we kept on working on the wounded, had them pretty well sedated with morphine and splinted those that we had to splint, and the dressings were all, we had dressings and one thing or another, and had used up all of our supplies, and heard a shell hit, small shell hit wood outside, and I thought, oh, they're just using that to get the range, they're gonna pour the big stuff in here in a minute. And so we instructed everybody to lie low, below the surface of the thing, but before Sergeant Stone was standing up, and I was just beginning to kneel down to take care of another fellow right beside him, and shell came through the window and hit, just tinked to the pinky finger on his right hand of Sergeant Stone, and splattered all over the side of my face. Broke my glasses, which was the most severe difficulty I had. I couldn't see to do much after that. That took the fight out of me. And said Sergeant Stone, and there was another medic from the 589th that had come in there to help us, because their guns were right within 100 yards of where we were. And some of their men were out there with a bazooka too. And I found out later at the association. So Sergeant Stone said, "Well, we've used up all of our supplies." And he said, "Everybody's all knocked out with morphine." He said, we got the truck here, but we can't take these fellows out under fire." He said, they're not paying attention to our Red Cross flag. And he said, "I think it's almost dark." He said, "I think we better go back and report to the captain and tell him that we'll come back, if somebody can come back after dark, while we can get these fellows out of here." And so we started to go towards the truck that was parked on the hill about 50 yards away, I guess. And so we were creeping and crawling, and to me, as far as I was concerned, whether my hearing was gone or what, I don't know, but I thought everything was perfectly quiet. And got to the truck and crawled on past of it, and I thought, I'm nuts to this. If they want to shoot me, I'm not going to crawl anymore. I'm going to walk in. So I stood up and walked into the woods and walked down to about 3/4 of a mile down to the aid station, and Stone was with me. Oh, we had, by Red Cross rules or one thing, we had to leave a medic with the wounded. And this 589th, I think his name was Maurice, I can't remember, Moores or Maurice, I can't remember what his first name was, and he'd only joined us at POE, I hadn't met him before. But he'd taken a piece of shrapnel or glass or something in his buttock, and he said he didn't think he could walk right then, and so he would stay. And when we got back, we found out he beat us back. But we had two fellows in volunteer to go back after dark, and they picked up the wounded. And years later, at one of the association reunions, they found out that I was one of those from the 592nd, and I got a chance to meet all of them that were in there. I don't think we lost any there, except what were all dead.
Right.
So that night, why, we got orders about, well, the only thing they had me do, because I guess they felt that I was not very reliable without my glasses. I had another pair, but I hadn't taken the time to go look for them in my duffel bag, and was working without my glasses, and they said, well, you make some hot chocolate for us, and because we hadn't had a chance to eat, wasn't any mess all open, and so we had, as part of the aid station's some routine supplies, as packages of stuff to make up hot chocolate, so I was made up some hot chocolate, then we got word that we're supposed to prepare to evacuate the positions about midnight, and that's when it was up to me to load the equipment from the aid station into the weapons carrier, the 3/4 ton, which we had to use as an ambulance. And they would only hold about, 2 on the bottom and 3, about 5 of the wounded. And so we put some of the wounded in a spare truck that service battery or somebody gave us. And that's when I was loading the stuff in. I had to have a place for what I thought were vital equipment, and there's no place to put it. So I tried stacking it all on my Jeep, which wasn't designed to handle it, and then the Jeep wouldn't pull it because it was mud. So then I had this one, it was pitch black, and to make room for the equipment, I had taken Captain Hanlon's footlocker, which had brand new uniforms. He was gonna go to Paris on a leave, and put them in the barn where the casualties were, and figured that, well, we'll be right back, so won't be a problem, and didn't tell him what I did, and made more room for stuff in the back of the Jeep, and got a hold of the driver of the truck and told him, I want to pull this Jeep trailer, but I said, I know that the tongue's real short, so there's not gonna be much room for me in there, and I said, we can't, we're all whispering this because the Germans are in town with us, he can't yell to stop, but I said, if you got your assistant driver, have him stand beside me, and when I get it hooked, I'll slap his hand and he'll come up and tell you to stop. Well, I forgot about, before that, while I was loading the vehicle, one of the pieces of equipment for the aid station was a lantern that had 3 lenses, white, red, and green. And it had a toggle switch that went from one to the other. Well, working in the dark, and I guess I had found some glasses by that time, but anyway, working in the dark and throwing things around and hurrying and one thing and another, this stupid lantern fell out and shot a beam of light. And of course, everybody in the battalion said, who's got that light on? Shoot the son of a bitch. So I quick covered it up with my overcoat in the mud and tried to use a toggle switch, but then I had to see if it was off or not. And of course, it went from white to green, and they were sure that somebody was signaling something with it, and all this commotion and one thing, I finally left the coat over the lantern and jumped on it and stomped the thing into the mud. So it was still shining, but it didn't shine through the mud. So that was my contribution to the Army at that point. And then I got crushed between the truck and the trailer, and I got the trailer hooked, and couldn't quite get out, and the truck stopped. But because of the mud, the truck rear wheel sunk in jackknife, so they pinched me in where I couldn't get out, and that was the last I remembered until somebody got the truck ahead, I guess, and pulled me out and put me in the truck with the rest of the wounded, and then the next morning, Captain was surprised to see me still there, but I think when they unloaded the rest of the wounded, it with my Red Cross armband, and one thing, they thought I was just a medic in for the ride, and left me there, and when I woke up in the morning, I was the only one in the truck bed, and went to look and see where everybody else was. And,
At this point, how badly hurt were you?
I didn't think I was too badly hurt. I don't even remember feeling any sting in my face or anything else. I guess I was too preoccupied or anything else. And of course, I didn't remember the truck. I didn't remember the crushing incident at all. And of course, when I finally got to where they took care of my wounds, I didn't say anything about, geez, I could have been drawing a pension all this time. Anyway, because that thing wasn't repaired until 2003, I guess, and they put a big patch over my diaphragm. So then from then on, why I was in the medical evacuation system for casualties. And that's when the Germans were everywhere, and everybody in every hospital was having to move to get to where they could do some work. And I got all the way back to Paris for Christmas, as I say, and then that's at Eupen is when I met up with the survivors from the massacre in Normandy. Actually, I guess you'd call us survivors too. We
All right.
beat our way out of there.
So what do you know now about sort of the route they took or the process they took to get you out of there? Because where were you starting from? Were you in St. Vith, or were you?
Get out of where?
Well, when you'd gotten hurt, you'd gotten hurt. You were crunched between the vehicle and the trailer, and then you had been taken back to some kind of hospital or aid station.
Well, I was awake. I woke up before they moved. Well, when I woke up, we were actually on the road pulling out of the positions.
Mm-hmm.
It was about midnight, and I could look out the back of the. I wasn't sure where we were at first, but somebody was shooting flares, and then I'd been on the road so much I could recognize the farm building, and okay, we were going down Skyline Drive towards Blyoff Junction in Purple Heart Crossroad. But they had an engineer cutoff that I'd used a couple times that bypassed the, and I was pretty sure they'd probably use that. It was just past the 590th battalion headquarters, and but they were machine gun fires. They were some group of engineers. I don't think they were. I think there was another group of engineers that was from Corps or one of the other that had been working in the area, and they took up arms and had machine gun cover. We could see tracer bullets going between our vehicles, and but these flares were lighting up the whole sky periodically. And then I noticed that we had passed 590th headquarters because of the buildings. And then we did take the engineer cutoff, but the 8 battery, the one that had all the casualties, missed the engineer's cutoff first, and had to take forever to get the vehicles turned around, and ran into, and the battalion commander was captured. And then the first sergeant, what I knew, Sergeant Beck, I knew quite well, ended up in the hospital that night at Eupen with me. So he got out, and the rest of them eventually got the B battery back online and joined the rest of the 592nd. So then it was, we got down engineers cut off, got through Schoenberg just before the Germans got into Schoenberg, and was pulled up outside of St. Vith in the same bivouac area we had the first night we arrived there, and the guns were firing on Laudesfeld, on where we had left our. They said, well, they wanted to destroy any equipment that they left behind, and I said, oh, there's the captain's foot locker. And he was standing there beside me, and I said, Captain, I got something to tell you. I took your foot locker and put it in the shed with the bodies, and I said, I figured we'd be back. I said, I had to make room for the equipment. I figured we'd be back in a day or so, and we could pick it up. his face got kind of red, and he was a real quiet guy anyway. And said, well, I don't think I'm going to go to Paris for a while. You know, that was what I said. But that's when he saw what kind of shape I was in, because he hadn't taken any time to look at me.
Mhm.
He said, well, I think maybe you better go in, get the pieces taken out. I can't do that here. And he said, you need to be on penicillin for a few days anyway, and get a tetanus shot. And we'll see you in a day or so. Well, it wasn't until the 10th of January that I got back to him.
All right. And then your route from there, you go to Eupen and then keep going after that?
Hospital at Eupen, that was bombed out, broke every piece of glass in the place. It was a beautiful schoolhouse. We were on the second floor, and the sirens blew, and I said, what's that? I said, well, that fellow there said, well, of course, you see, they were used to being quiet in that area. I said, well, I said, that's just a test probably. He said, they do that every once in a while. I said, well, where are we supposed to go? I said, I don't know, we have to stay here on duty. I said, why don't you go over in the stairwell if you're worried? And I said, well, I just on a cot up here, and I think I will go to the stairwell. And about that time, they dropped a bomb and landed right next door to the hospital, within 20 yards, 20, 50 yards, hit which wasn't supposed to be there, hit an ammo dump. You're not supposed to have that near a hospital with a Red Cross on it. But the Germans did that, and we did too. And the explosion blew a Jeep that was parked beside the building up on top of the roof. At first it was only one story. I looked out there and saw the Jeep out there in the morning. I didn't see it at night. And it started a little fire, but that's about all. But it broke every window in the upper story anywhere where we were, and glass was all over everywhere, my bed and everything else. So I said, what? I said, well, I asked Orly, I said, well, what do I do now? I can't sleep in I can't lay down in a bunch of glass. He said, I know. I said, we all got problems. You said, we got some extra beds stored in the basement. He said that the nurses are supposed to use that as a shelter if they're here, but he said they all built it across the street. He said, I don't think there's somebody in there. If you want to go down there, well, you go in down there, because they were expecting casualties, but they hadn't been able to get the casualties there, so they weren't real busy at that time. There weren't a whole lot of us in the building, and so I went down and felt my way in the dark. Knocked my glasses off again, blew my helmet off when the shell hit, and I found my glasses in amongst the debris and put those on, and found my helmet that just had a white circle on it without any red cross, and felt my way along to the door that gave way, and sure enough, in there I could feel some bunk beds. So I crawled on the bunk bed, and pretty soon there was a whole gaggle of female voices, and the nurses were coming over, and they had just arrived. They were brand new, and they were all excited. Well, they understood that, and the reason that they had to leave their quarters was that there was an unexploded bomb in their attic. Second shell had landed in their attic, and they were told to go across the street into the shelter and wait. Of course, nobody had any lights. Nobody had any lights on. Everybody's feeling the way. And I thought, I don't want to end up in here with the nurses. Somebody's gonna ask some questions. So I fell along the wall until I got to where the door was, and I slid back out, went back upstairs, and sat on it. Well, by that time it was about daylight, and they began processing us to move us to Liège. And as I say, the Germans were shooting buzz bombs into there about every hour or so, about 20 minutes apart, and we were just in tents, and they'd already knocked out one building that had some patients in, and we're shooting at the rail yards, but they hardly ever hit it. And payoff is that years later at medical school in Michigan, I saw this student who was obviously a foreign student hanging out in the halls and looking kind of lost. I asked him what he wanted, and he said, well, he was a political science student that the German government had sent to teach them how to become a democracy, and he really wanted to be in medical school. I wondered if there were any classes he could go to, and I said, well, sure, the big lecture halls, they won't have me ask you about it. So then I got to talking to him, and he was a 14-year-old SS trooper that they had commandeered to, with their slide rules, do the computations for fixing the explosion times and one thing or other, and courses for Liège. At the time I was in the hospital. So that was kind of unusual.
Right.
Then after 4 days, when they sort of got the range, I don't think they were intending to, but they knocked down some tents, and so they were getting nervous about it, and the hospital there was pretty full by that time. And they put us in a luxury train, and it went to Paris. But we sweated out in the rail yards because we were worried that for once the Germans might accidentally hit the rail yard. And while we were down there, the women from the town came on and gave each of us a little aluminum medal as thank you, Liège. I've got it downstairs. It said thank you, Liège on it, which was real nice. We figured if they wanted to go on that, be on that train and weren't that nervous, well, it was all right. It was probably all right. So we got to Paris, and then my course of penicillin shots ended, and they took the stitches out of my wounds, and it was Christmas, and the staff there said, well, we don't want to send you fellas to a replacement depot on Christmas, we'll send you on the next day. And then the next day, Red Stars had dropped later, the Germans had dropped one of the last bombs that the German Air Force dropped anywhere, I guess, was in Paris. And didn't do any damage, I guess, but landed near the hospital where I was being kept. So then I worked my way back through replacement depots, and everybody wanted to know where the 106 was. I didn't know where the 106 was. Didn't know where I was going or what was coming next. And E-Tom's was the first replacement depot. It had been a French barracks that was used by the Germans when they were in the area. And the only running water we had was a big fountain with spouts out in the center of the barrack compound, and it was cold water, and you washed or shaved or drank or did whatever you wanted to there. And they had some pit latrines, I think, but the biggest problem was it wasn't heated, and the windows were all broken out. And if I was only there for a day, one evening, and that night, and the next day, and the next night, and then they went, and then they sent me to Fontainebleau to another replacement depot. But while we were there, the fellas didn't care about anything. They were gonna, most of them were coming out of the hospital and going back to the front anyway, just like I was. And for firewood, there was a little stove there, but no wood. So they'd take the slats out of the bunks, but leave enough so that you couldn't tell which ones that they were out of, and use the slats for kindling and build a fire. And of course, the first guy that dove into the bunk ended up on the floor. That was, nobody knew how that happened. But I saw what they were doing, so I made sure that I had a bottom bunk, and that the bunks ahead of me weren't, had all their slats, so I wasn't have somebody down on top of me. From there, I went to Fontainebleau. I didn't do anything, only just while I was there was a big thrill, because it was the day after Christmas. And the next morning, heard this tremendous roar and looked up a couple of miles in the sky, and the airborne were going to relief of Bastogne. They were touring gliders, and it was just remarkable of the sky trails that they were leaving. I mean, there were hundreds of them, and they were real high, but you could hear the roar, and we were all real thrilled at that. And but then we went by truck to Fontainebleau, which isn't too far from E-Tom's is right on the outskirts of Paris, and Fontainebleau was a little further away. We went by truck. I don't know how many went with me, but got down there, and that was Napoleon's cavalry barracks and barns in beautiful place. The building we were in was quite substantial. Of course, it went back to, 1800 some. And had nice beds and heated and a huge courtyard that was covered for a mess hall. They must have fed 1,000 soldiers in there. I guess it's only about 500 each shift. I think we fed 3 shifts. I think you could, wasn't anybody that kept you from going any shift you wanted or going to all 3 if you were that hungry. Food wasn't bad, but they drew, didn't make any difference what your rating was at that point. Of course, I was only a corporal, but we had master sergeants and everything else in the room with me. And everybody drew numbers to see which occupation you had for the day, and I drew KP for the only time I was in the Army. And my job was to mop down all of those floors in Napoleon's stables, and they were all cobblestone, which didn't come clean anyway. And then when it was time to serve, well, I had to help carry those big steel containers of food out, but I was used to working in the kitchen, and I didn't buy, and it gave me something to do, so it wasn't that bad. But I thought, geez, the medics don't have to pull KP, but go to a repo depot, you take what's given you. I got back to the barracks, and they all greeted me with, "You lucky stiff." Why? I said, "Why?" I said, "Well, we drew cuts. One person to a room was allowed to go out tonight, New Year's Eve. Go out tonight on go out on the town, New Year's Eve." I said, "Well, I don't have any money. What am I gonna do? I'm not gonna have any money or anything." They said, "Oh yeah, go on and get it. Well, you can see some people anyway." And somebody gave me a little money, I guess, and I went with a group. And the first place we stopped was an ice cream parlor, but it was what they called ice glaciers or something, icy stuff, more like sherbet type of thing. It was all right. And then we saw a lighted, beautiful place at Chateau with the courtyard and everything. It had a big cement porch with steps, like you see in the pictures and one thing, and there was a party going on. So, and of course, we're all combat loaded because we're ready to, from there we go to the front. I'm loaded with medical bags, but that's my only load. And we go up to see what's going on. There's music playing, and so we stay out on the veranda out there, and the windows are all open. And of course, some of the ladies see us out there, and they want us to come in, but it was an officers only party. This caused some consternation, and of course, this group of infantrymen I'm with could care less about authority or anything else at that point, and they're loaded. And first thing I know, somebody shot out a chandelier, and we decided we weren't welcome, and we left. And fortunately, we were on board before they got around to checking on who was out where, while we were on board a train for the front the next morning. And we had 40 and 8s and made one stop in Paris, and we were all allowed to get out and stretch and look around and given a time when we had to be back. And I think most of us came back. I'm pretty sure we all did, because the MPs would have seen to it. And I was anxious to get back somewhere. I had rippled depots there for the birds. And got aboard the train, and we stopped it was 5 days getting back to Belgium, because that train had to stop and let priority trains go by. Had no heat, and there were 40 and 8s, you're supposed to have 40 men or 8 horses, and we had more than 40 men, but we all had our equipment, a duffel bag, 60 pounds of duffel, and plus arms and everything else. We had to take turns laying down. one group would lay down and the other would stand up, and then we would switch. And we tried everything to get some heat because it was cold out, and we'd leave the doors open because it was dark in there, and so we could see during the daylight. And then we'd get cold, and somebody got the bright idea that we got a garbage can cover and put it in the center of the car, and got, of course, the engines were stoked with coal, got coal, and started a fire with in the pan on the floor of the thing, and this was fine as long as the doors were open. But then it got cold, and you had to leave the doors open because of smoke. And we all looked like we were all African by the time we got to the place where they dumped us off in the middle of the night in Infantry, Belgium, or somewhere up near the Belgian, German, Holland, Dutch border. And the last replacement depot I was in, and well, no, next to last. And so the other thing they did is we stopped at one freight yards, and there was huge casks of wine on flat cars. So somebody had the bright idea that we took our helmets off, and somebody cut loose with a machine gun, and we all had a spout that we could tap into the wine from. So that was entertainment for that day. And fortunately, the train would let us off and then give 2 tweets on a whistle before he was ready to pull out, and we'd all come running in from any place or every place. But we all loaded up early on that occasion and waited for the whistle to blow before somebody found out what we did. And they got to Santron, Belgium at the middle of the night, and got unloaded, and of course it was, you could hear enemy fire, or you could hear gunfire in the background, and some cannons, and so we knew we were getting close. And they said, "Well, we've got places for you to stay tonight." And he said, we know you're hungry, haven't had anything to eat on that train, but he said, "We can't fix anything for you tonight." But he said, "We'll have a good meal for you in the morning. You come down here in daylight, and the sergeant here is gonna take you up and show you where you can spend the night." Well, we marched about a mile to a farmhouse and carrying 60, 65 pounds of luggage. I had a bad knee most of the time, and that was bothering me. But geez, at least we were off that train, and we got to the farmhouse, and they opened up the barn doors and said, "There's your bed," and man, it was nice, clean straw, and we all dove in and got a real good night's sleep for a change, and it was a nice morning, nice sunny morning the next morning. Got out and went back, got lined up. The group of us got everybody out, and we going back for breakfast. We didn't have any of the camp officers with us, but we had a first sergeant with us that was going back for the 3rd time from being wounded after Africa and Italy, and he was from Patton's outfit in the south. We just were ambling along and got close to where we were supposed to have breakfast, and a group of 3 officers stopped us, and of course we were all black-faced, and we hadn't had time to clean up or anything else, and we looked like a mess. And this fellow started berating us for our appearance. And his first sergeant stepped out, and he saluted and said, "Sir," well, that was the first thing. None of us saluted when we went by, so they stopped us. And I mean, this was not true of many officers, but in this case it was. And he said, "Who's in charge here?" I said, and first sergeant said, "Well, nobody's been designated in charge, but I guess I'm the ranking one." He said, "Sorry, sir, we just got off the train last night." And what a motley mess you are. He said, you were a disgrace to the United States Army. And First Sergeant said, sir, I believe I remember you from Africa. He said, we're gonna go down and get something to eat and we'll get cleaned up. But he says, don't you give us any trouble. And officer's face got red and the other two officers beside him looked at him, couldn't see what it was. And First Sergeant said, well, I said, I was guessing, but I think I remember that he was cashiered out of the African campaign. He said, I don't remember what for, but he said it just happens that I think I did recognize him, and the way he acted, I think maybe I was right. So anyway, we went back, and then we got fed a real good meal, and then we went back, and this little farm girl came out with hot water for all of us, and then showed us around the town. And then we were only there for a day and got picked up by a truck, and we were all divided up at that point, and that's when they found out I was with airborne returnees, and the truck only went, we took a real devious route because we were close to the front, and I don't remember exactly where we spent the night, but that's when they told me for sure that I was going to go to the 82nd Airborne. And we were in tents, pyramidal tents in that place. It was nice and clean, and we had fresh, clean straw there too. And they fed us a pretty good meal in the morning. And then they drove me, I think I got on board another truck about 10 o'clock that morning. And the troopers with me got dropped off late in the afternoon, but it was after dark when I was the only one left in the truck, and they said, well, they'd finally located 106th Infantry Division headquarters. I said, I was going to 87. Well, they said, they're with the 117th Parachute Infantry Regiment. He said, they're assigned as artillery for them. He said, but their headquarters is quite a ways from the front yet. He said, that's here in Antistes, and there was a sign outside the door, 106th Infantry, and I was back home.
Mm-hmm.
And the next morning, the mailman took me up to the battalion, and they were just outside of a little town of Foss that was being pretty heavily contested, and we were right with the 82nd Airborne. Was a headache to be with because if they got resistance, they just bypassed it and left it for somebody else. If they didn't want to be bothered with any prisoners, and so they just left them there. So the Army went along behind and got busy taking care of everybody. And then they, with all the confusion, why sometimes they'd be shooting at each other. And I was lined up next morning after we got back to the unit. I was lined up in a chow line outside this building that we had for an aid station. And I was standing at the back of the line in front of a kind of a shed that was sort of like a corn crib. It wasn't tightly closed. It was kind of a ramshackle place, which most of the places there were pretty deep kept. But the fellow ahead of me was visiting with me, and I heard something whiz by and looked up, and there was a bullet embedded in the wood in the shed behind me. And this fellow said, hey, well, he said, you got to get used to that. He said, when you're with the airborne boys, you don't know who's shooting at you, whether it's the enemy or them or your own men. He said, just get used to it. And so that was my introduction to getting back with the unit. But we didn't take many casualties after that. I had an occasion where the only time we pulled back for 2 days rest. The reason he did that is to change the barrels on the gun. We'd shot so many rounds that the howitzers all needed to have the barrels replaced. And we were in this one farm building in a chateau enclosed thing that had buildings that would accommodate the whole battery, servo battery. And they had a howitzer in there in this one area that they were working to take the barrel off, and there's a side pouch on each of the carriers of the howitzers for a grenade to destroy the weapon before they're captured. And this one had not been threaded, so the grenade was still in there, but they checked it to make sure that the grenade was still in there. Well, when they opened up the canister and took the grenade out, apparently a German patrol had been in there and armed the grenade. And so they had a live grenade inside of a barn and next to the howitzer, and all of them jumped and got behind the gun before it went off, but one or two of them got some nicks, and that was the only casualties that we had.
Okay,
For
now,
some
you
time
were
after
back, were you still with the airborne at this point, or are you
No,
back with your
well,
own?
we were
unit?
attached.
Okay, you were attached to them,
We
but
were
you're,
artillery attached to, which means that for command control, it only meant for command, personnel had nothing to do with it much. But for command control, which probably came down through Corps, they told you who to support, but you drew on them for supplies because they had the better transport and supply unit, and you could draw supplies from them, and you worked right alongside with them, and they could change you on a minute's notice. They could assign you to another corps or infantry unit in the area for 592nd to give support fire
right,
too.
okay. So
So
you're
it's
still, you're,
strictly organizational
right,
stuff. It
okay.
didn't-
Basically, the 592nd is being attached to other units because there is no 106th to be attached to at this point.
There's nothing except the 592nd and the 591st and the, what's left of the 424 infantry. And they were in the area with us, but we weren't necessarily assigned
Right.
for fire strictly on them. We were fire for anybody in the area that needed fire. You know.
All right. Now, at this point then, are the Americans kind of pushing the Germans back,
yeah,
and you're advancing and moving regularly now?
The day I arrived was the high, in that area of the front was the high point for the Germans at that particular point. Now, within a few days, they had some bridges. The terrain was such that there were two or three rivers came together at a place called Farmhouse in Stavelo. And the bridges there had not been destroyed. The Americans had, the engineers had them armed for destruction, but the German tanks ran out of gas before they got there. And that's at the point where they were when I joined, because the next day, I think it was the next day, or no, it was about 3 days, we had left Foss and gone to Petit Terre, I think it was. We were hopping every 3 or 4 days to keep up with the 82nd and the 591st, or the, for the
424.
424. Captain Hanlon found out that his brother was a surgeon with the 30th Division, and they were on our left flank, several units away, because we had to go about 20 miles, and in Stavelo and Tripounce is where we had. He knew they were in that area, but he didn't know which hospital they were at or what they were doing anyway. So I had been out several times during the week, and I had to be careful because German patrols that were left behind by the forces that were beginning to move forward were everywhere, and I had to learn where you could go and where you couldn't go, or where I thought I could go, couldn't go. So with the liaison officer for the battalion, I would go visit him in the morning and find out where the pins on his map were and memorize those. And so I told the captain, I said, well, I'm not sure that I can get to the bridges in Stavlaw from what Captain and S3 told me. I said, well, he said, I want to go anyway. Okay. So we went and he found his brother. We crossed the bridges and they hadn't blown them up yet. And got back and the liaison officer looked me up and he said, how'd you do? I said, we didn't have any problems. And he said, what route did you take? He showed me the tactical map and I showed him here. He said, oh, I can move that pin then.
So you were doing reconnaissance
So I
work.
said, thanks a lot. But that was, from then on, it was mostly unhook, get ready and move again. And it was mainly just, by this time the fellows had learned to take care of their feet. There wasn't that much trench foot. And actually, from then on, as far as we were concerned, of course the infantry was taking a beating, but at that point, why, as far as we were concerned, there wasn't much combat activity. We had some psychotic breakdowns and a couple of fellows. Because we'd been on the line for continuously, everybody else had come, we left, 82nd left us and we still stayed on until March.
And at this point, the artillery is not really being hit by enemy fire now.
Not at
So,
that
so
time,
you're
no.
not taking the casualties.
No.
Okay. Well, tape number 2 is now done. So I'm going to rewind that.